as things completely fell apart, that's when I felt most loved, ironically. It wasn't until, this was 2008 and we were going through the recession. So the funding had bottomed out for the nonprofit organization. I went through a divorce. My whole world, like everything just turned upside down. And it wasn't until I was at my most broken, most vulnerable place and was surrounded by people who loved me in the midst of that and said, "You're okay. It's going to be all right," that I was finally able to receive love. Because up until that point, I was always the one doing the fixing, or at least I thought I was. And probably in some cases making more of a mess.
Hello, my people. Today we have a special treat. Well, it's always a treat for me because I get to, in this format, hang out with my friends who I love and respect. You have just tuned into another episode of Vision Builders, so welcome back. And this is a show about freedom, what it is, what it takes to create it, and how to share it, and the age-old practice of leveraging other people's hindsight to bring clarity to our own developing stories. So with us today is Tamara Fyke, who is the founder, I would say chief servant officer of Love in a Big World. She has other titles, but I see what she's been doing over the past, at least, I don't know, has it been like 16 years that I've known you? Something like 50? Yeah.
Yeah.
This has just been an incredible ride, at least to witness or to be a part of at times. So I'll just go from there and just say, hey, welcome, Tamara.
Thanks, Chu.
So I don't want to start with Love in a Big World, just because like that's clearly been your mission, your heart, your point of at the wall, so to speak, where you've been building in the world. But the reality is there is now, like, we couldn't have seen it coming, I guess, 15 years ago. There's now in the space this idea of social emotional learning. Nobody used that language back in the day.
No.
But when I tell my friends or educators that I know, if you're going to talk about social emotional learning, you got to talk to Tamara, because she kind of wrote the book on the. I mean, I don't think that's overspeaking, really, because done the research or done the work like you have, and I want to talk about all of that today. But first, I want to turn back the clock a little bit and try to figure out what led you to this journey that you're on. What were there any big influences or any big events that you can think of or point to in your life that were super influential that kind of led you to the journey that you're on right now?
Yes, thank you for asking. There are several that I can point to. I think most influential in my early years was my time in the church. And I grew up in a multiracial church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the mid 70s, right? So I didn't realize, I keep telling people this, I didn't know how naive I was, but I didn't realize how uncommon it was for Black people, white people, brown people of every socioeconomic status to come together on a weekly basis in 1976. So if you put that in a time frame, I mean, that was what, just 7, 8, 9 years after MLK was assassinated? And that was my normal. So we came together, we did life together. It wasn't just a Sunday morning worship thing. It was house meetings and just doing life together. Coupled with the fact that I went to a small private Christian school in Pittsburgh. as well, which the people go, oh, you went to a private school. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Greater Works Academy was committed to accepting people of every walk of life, and it had a choose your own tuition philosophy.
Oh, wow.
So there were some families who paid, a premium every month because they could, and there were some families who came for free. But everyone was welcome. And again, it was a very diverse and inclusive environment, just like my church was. So it's taken me pretty much my whole life to unpack the fact that those early experiences shaped who I am and why I look at the world the way that I do. Because that was my normal. That was just my normal. And it's not been until the past, I guess it was last year, it was around last fall, a friend of mine, she's one of my dearest friends. We've been friends for over 20 years, white woman. But she herself has a very diverse experience. But she came to me, she goes, why do you like Black people so much? And I was like.
Like that? She was
really?
like, was it like one of those, why?
Yeah, it was like, and she goes, you have to understand that those of us who like watch your life and see how you live, like we don't get it. Like you have to explain to us what brought you to this place and why. And she's one of my dearest friends. And I was like, because it's normal. Like this is just, but I think like that's all of that has shaped who I am and why I do what I do. And it's been a journey, and we can dig into that. But I'm really grateful for the adults in my life at that time who valued diversity, inclusion, community, and above all else, love for fellow human beings. And I tease my mom and dad sometimes. I'm like, y'all were hippies and you didn't even know it. They were like the Christian version of hippie. And I'm just incredibly grateful for the upbringing that I've had and how it shaped my view of the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said a lot of things that I think are maybe worth unpacking a little bit.
Sure.
One, you've alluded to this idea of journey, and from where you started to where you are now, what I find fascinating is that there is some consistency. Like you are basically building the world that you expected. Do you know what I mean? Like you have gone through kind of a lot in order to build this world that you expected, because the world that you grew up in and came to love and see as normal wasn't the world at large when you left the nest, so to speak. And so you have been busy trying to kind of, I think of Plato's allegory of the cave. Like you were the one who saw the colorful landscape and the sunrise and on all the air, the fresh air, and tried to tell everybody about it. And so I find that fascinating. And the other thing that I find interesting too is this idea of influence that seems to be, because you can't do, I mean, like for those of you who are watching, I feel like at this point it's important. I mean, I feel like Tamara and I are maybe having like an inside conversation because we've been friends for a lot of years, but she has not just an organization, but like I feel like you said, your friends who are observing you, like the wake of your life, as far as I've observed it, has kind of been one that says, come along, wherever you are, whatever you. In fact, that's kind of what happened. That's how you and I became friends. Josh, my brother-in-law, had done some stuff with you and was like, hey, you need to meet Tamara. And then he said to you, you need to meet you, and maybe he can help you with something. And it was, I just kind of got caught up in this, come along, we're doing some cool things. You might want to join. And I did. And it was, I mean, it seems like a lifetime ago, but that was kind of the beginning of that tendency that you have to just bring people along in whatever that you're doing, I think out of a belief that it's good, has just kind of been, I think, from the outside looking in, that's kind of who you are and who you've been. And I find it fascinating. So, creating what you expected, I think also too, as we talk about the subject of freedom, I define freedom as the ability to create that which brings you joy and blesses other people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a simple definition, but in my mind, like, freedom is not just doing whatever you want whenever you want it, because there's consequences, right?
Right.
But if I have the freedom to create in the world what blesses other people and brings me joy, I'm truly free, right? So I'm curious if you've given much thought just to what that looks like for you, if you have a definition that you go by, or if it's something that's been important to you when interacting with people.
It's always fascinating to me to hear people talk about me, because I don't see me the same way at all. Like, I know me as, the person who still stubs her toe in the middle of the night and runs into doors and says, "Excuse me," to the door frame. I mean, like, I don't see me like you see me, right? And so I'm listening to you, I'm like, oh wow. I don't know. Like, I don't really know how to answer that, except to just say I think that I just have a whole lot of love in my heart, and I feel like that's what we need the most of. And somebody asked me the other day where that came from, and I think that it came from the fact that I have gone through so much suffering, and the fact that I have experienced great pain and have been in terrible messes and have been accepted anyway, and championed anyway, has given me this desire to share that same love with other people.
Yeah.
And to tell other people, like, hey, this kind of love is possible if you give yourself permission to experience it, both as the giver and the receiver.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, that big lesson didn't happen until well after you and I met.
Funny how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, like, initially I thought I was just gonna save the world, and then found out I was the one who needed saved, So yeah. I don't know. I just feel like we're all better together. And so how can we, when you talk about that come along thing, I just, like, we're all better together and we have a purpose. Mm-hmm. So when we work together, we can accomplish the mission that is set before us.
Yeah, I think it's important too to just take a minute and just look at there was a sequence, right? And I don't mean a long sequence, because we're not going to go into, I wish we could, but we would have then like a 10-hour podcast that would need a part 3 and 4 and 5 as well. Like that would,
yeah.
But the sequence, like the idea of loving other people, or attempting to, going through some things and realizing that you also need to learn to receive love. You know what I mean? I feel like is something that, at least in my own life, I liken it to, I used to play sports a little bit. I played a little sports, and I remember as an athlete always being willing to play hurt, but always encouraging my teammates to take a break if they needed to rest. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I feel like there's a phase, if your intention in the world is to do good things, there's a phase for most of us where we go through where we're perfectly happy to tell somebody else, take care of yourself, self-care, just rest. We've got your back. But but if that same sort of grace is turned towards us, we sometimes struggle to accept it. And I feel like for anybody listening to this, I want them to know that they're not like that. If that's a point where they feel like they're wrestling or struggling with, they're like, that's okay. That nobody gets it right out of the gate. At least I don't know any person around me who got that right out of the gate when you actually start to unpack their stories. And it's part of the reason why we want to do this show is because like unpacking those stories make it a little bit more, like you said, we're all in this together. We're better together. That's what you said. And that if we can see more of our commonalities and our common ground, you know, were you aware when the shift kind of started, where you were like perfectly happy to go crusade and save the world, when you started to realize like, I am also responsible to stop and receive grace, to receive mercy, were you aware as it was happening, or was it more of like a hindsight thing?
I was caught up in the middle of it. And it was, I don't know how deep you want me to go, but it was the beginning of the dissolution of my marriage that I started to recognize my own humanity in a way that I never really had before. And the impact of that on my children. And as things fell apart, because we ended up divorced, as things completely fell apart, that's when I felt most loved, ironically. It wasn't until, this was 2008 and we were going through the recession. So the funding had bottomed out for the nonprofit organization. I went through a divorce. My whole world, like everything just turned upside down. And it wasn't until I was at my most broken, most vulnerable place and was surrounded by people who loved me in the midst of that and said, "You're okay. It's going to be all right," that I was finally able to receive love. Because up until that point, I was always the one doing the fixing, or at least I thought I was. And probably in some cases making more of a mess, but if I'm really honest. But it really took coming to that place of brokenness and understanding that I'm loved not because of what I do, but just because of who I am.
Yeah. Wow. One of the reasons, low key, that I do this is not just to like provide content for viewers. Like, my expectation is that I'm gonna get better and grow and learn and such through this. And so hopefully people just kind of come along with my own journey. And I just want you to know, like, it's interesting that it's not until we get in touch with our own need and recognize that it is a need that, like, AKA, if we don't, we die, right? Like, that we start to also get comfortable with the source of delivery, of provision for that need, right? So like, and I think it's fascinating too, that you've always been, even if you didn't realize it, you've always been such an includer. Like, you've always been the person who kind of brought people together for stuff. Yet, when you needed support, none of those people were like, forgot your number, or I don't say none. I don't know if it was you were batting 1,000, but necessarily, like, certainly there were enough people like you just described who stepped up and just loved on you. And I think that's very, very, a very real part of the human experience, is that just to go back to the sport analogy, it wasn't until I was injured to the point of like, I can't really walk, that I started to realize like, I maybe need a plan B. Like I need to maybe approach this differently. Right. Like I maybe need to, or I mean, in the situation where like, not that I want to timestamp this, but right now at the time of this recording, we're in the middle of, well, the reason I didn't drive down to Nashville and see you face to face is this global pandemic. And at the time of this recording, and so making some changes in my business, and I know that you have. I want to talk about that a little bit, because of what's going on. It wasn't until some of the changes that I've made were ones that mentors of mine had suggested that I make a long time ago. But I guess I was just too hard-headed or something to do any of that. And until I needed to, did I actually go, okay, well, I guess I need a new plan. I guess we need to think differently about this. So, all right, well, I want to talk a little bit about Love in a Big World, because like your story is a little unique in that your life's work and life's work and mission and vocation have kind of all, you're like the unicorn, so to speak, right? Like, I know it doesn't feel like that all the time, but the reality is the thing that I mean, I don't know, I'm going to put not words in your mouth, but you wake up every day with some level of clarity of mission that most people, if we're being honest, are searching for. And do you have any idea or insight as to how you came to that? Because like the story that you tell of your upbringing and what you're trying to do in the world, that's like personal mission. But the fact that the work of your hands is inclusive with that mission, is there any insight that you could look back and say, well, here's how? Or is it more, I mean, just, I guess, share that a little bit.
Sure. I love kids, and I think part of that is because I'm a big kid myself.
Fair assessment.
I love to play, and for the longest time, if I'm really transparent, I would say I felt much more comfortable in the world of children than I did in the world of adults. And that's some of the work that I've had to do in my own journey, is like growing myself up. To be honest. But I remember, right after college, I went to Belmont here in Nashville, Tennessee, graduated from there. And I started working, I was still in college at the time, but I started working at an aftercare program. And it was an aftercare program in the city. So there were lots of urban kids. And I just fell in love with those babies. And so after I graduated, I started working on staff there for a bit. And I was also a substitute teacher in some of the urban schools in Nashville. And I think it was that mix of having grown up in Pittsburgh and having the urban experience with my church, and then finding that urban experience here in Nashville, because Nashville is extremely segregated even to this day. I mean, we were doing better, but it's still pretty segregated. So just finding that combination of things, and then recognizing the dire need of the babies that I was working with. So I remember, teaching for the 6th grade teacher all the time at a neighborhood that was a school near a neighborhood really close to downtown. And my kids, at the end of the day, we would stand around and we'd wait for buses to be called and for them to walk home and whatever. And we'd start talking. And I had told them, like, as a sub, they do bad things unless you bribe them. So I would bribe them with like, hey, I'll sing for you at the end of the day. And they're like, oh, okay. Can the white girl sing? And so that was, always part of the mix. And they would talk to me and say, even at 12 years old, they're like, yeah, we're probably going to die. like by the age of 21. And that was their mindset.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking, like, this is not okay with me. Like, for 12-year-olds to already say that they're going to die by the age of 21 because of the violence in their neighborhood, I can't live with that. Like, that's not okay in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
So what can I do? And, I came to Nashville like many people do as a songwriter. And I thought, okay, how can music be used? And that was the first tool I had at hand. How can music be used to help kids think differently? How can music be used to shape mindsets and give some hope? So that was really the beginning of the work.
Wow. It's funny. You just made a very traumatic experience sound like a dainty, nice little story. But I mean, imagine I'm trying to picture myself in that moment, like, or in what's more likely a series of moments.
Yeah.
Months of moments, right? And I imagine you didn't just go to bed one night and say, well, what can I do? And then the answer just appeared.
No, I mean, like, I had done some youth work back in Pittsburgh before I moved to Nashville. I was singing, I was working with kids. Like, it was kind of this amalgamation of like, oh, and at the time, even though social and emotional learning wasn't a thing, positive youth development was a thing,
Sure.
character education was a thing. So what we do in education is we just change names.
Yeah.
We add more research and we change the name, but it's really the same thing.
Yeah.
So seriously. So yeah, I mean, I've been doing this work for a really long time, and now the world around me is kind of caught up to it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, you're right. It wasn't just a one-shot dealio, but I think those kids, those sixth graders, were what put me over the edge.
Yeah.
And the fact that not only do I have a heart for making a difference, but I grew up in an entrepreneurial family. Mm-hmm. So the idea of taking risks and wanting to do something new with whatever it was that I had at hand was not that strange to me.
So I'm gonna veer off and try to bring it back for just a second. Like, you just said something that keeps kind of coming up as a pattern as I sit down and have these conversations. I grew up in an entrepreneurial family. Mm-hmm. My parents were academics, but also entrepreneurial. I mean, I think that's part of like the immigrant story, right? There's always this, how are we going to make it ours? How are we going to have ownership over our skill set? And so, but I think you just said something about, like, again, like what you expected. And I think as a takeaway or as a nugget for anybody who's listening to this, who's trying to sort out their own responsibility for their own lives, like, what you looked at growing up certainly affected what you expected for yourself, or what you even thought was possible, what you were afraid of versus what you were not afraid of. And so taking some risks. So the other thing that I wanted to point out, kind of bringing it back to this conversation, when I was a kid, I lived in Decatur, Georgia, the Deck. If you've ever listened to any of the music that came out of Atlanta in the 90s, it's a very sung about, rapped about community, right? And so the town that I lived in, Jesse Jackson was around. And so when I was in first grade, I think, my brother was in third grade, we were in elementary school at Snapfinger Elementary for anybody who is watching this and knows the place. We were there for an assembly, and Jesse Jackson actually came and said, it was an elementary school at the time. There were 808 kids. 806 of us were Black. There was one white girl who had very pale skin, freckles, and flaming red hair. And for whatever reason, her parents just were not interested in busing her out to a white school, right? Which, somebody was willing to do that. And then the other kid who wasn't Black was one of the teacher's sons. They were from, I want to say Guatemala. And that was it. So he didn't say anything like, if you're black, stand up. He just said, stand up and give yourself a hug. He said, all the boys stand up and give yourself a hug. Now, mind you, I'm in first grade. So I'm 6 years old. And he says, statistically speaking, one in 4 of you will not make it to 21. He started talking about how we were an endangered species, and he started talking about, inner city violence and gang stuff. And basically his whole message was, you have an opportunity to focus on what you do want, so you don't become what you don't want, right? So what you're talking about is very, very real. Like, I thought where I live was a suburb. It didn't seem very, very city to me, but for whatever reason, we were in that same sort of a boat. But it was a nice area. I thought, when you're in a rough area and you're a kid, you don't know.
No, yeah.
Because we were the kids who had to be in when the streetlights came on, right? But but one of the things that you said a little bit earlier is the whole asking yourself questions. I imagine that hasn't stopped. Can you talk a little bit about the moments? Can you think of like some turning points that were the result of you just asking the question, what can I do? Or how can I change, or how can I pivot? Any big moments kind of stand out?
Well, I'm in the midst of one of those questions today. Like, I just got off the phone. Yeah, I just got off the phone with my brother before our time together. And I was like, I just need to talk to you about this idea. And he just kept saying to me, well, it sounds like you have it figured out. Sounds like that's a good idea. Why don't we do that? And I'm just like, okay, all right. So, I have these moments of epiphany of how things need to pivot or change. And sometimes I'll go full force at those, like I did early quarantine. So what happened then was, it was like March 18th. And literally March 18th. And I'm sitting at my house going, oh, yeah, we're all in lockdown. Children are not in school. What are we going to do? We can't reach them. We can't reach the teachers. Hey, why don't we create a TV show? And so I just, like, that day got on the phone with some of my friends and was like, hey, so what if we do this thing called Music City Kids, and it features like Love in a Big World and your work with Be Well and your work with this group. And so it's Janet's Planet and all these people, small businesses, small nonprofits, who all found themselves like, oh, what do we do now that we can't be with kids in school? So, that was a Wednesday, and we went live on Monday. So there are with the first show. So there are moments.
If you're listening to this I hope you rewind and listen to that again. Like, problem, idea, solution, questions asked, and then after it, like.
Yeah.
And I called you yesterday, and you were actually shooting another Music City. So it's still going. This isn't something that you tried and then it petered out.
No, and like at this point, so like we ran the quarantine edition from March 23rd until the end of May. So to finish out that school year, then we took a 2-week break. We did a summer edition, and then we picked up again August. I think it was August 5th, because we've been back in school for almost a month now here in Nashville. So we're doing it again. And I have an executive producer who works with me on the show, and we were doing kind of the debrief after. I was like, you know what, Phil, sometimes I'm like, why are we doing this? Like, what is it making a difference? Is anybody watching? Is there value? Like all this. I said, but what I keep coming back to is the fact that we need to be consistent. Because right now we're still building awareness and we're building viewership, and there are people tuning in. There's word that's spreading, like, and hopefully, and part of that question that happened yesterday was because we had applied for some funding and been denied. And it was just like, so, up till this point, yeah, and it was really like
Yeah.
angst. Up till this point, it's been an act of love. Like on my part, everybody involved has done this on a volunteer basis.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and there's a cost to that. I mean, there's a financial cost, there's an emotional cost. So it's just I think that's part of it. When you know you're committed to doing something good in the world, you have to do it because it's the right thing to do, not because of the return.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I really struggle with. And like even saying this out loud is that whole idea of you will reap what you sow. Mm-hmm. So I've been sowing for a really long time. And I'm hoping that the reaping will come soon. And I think it will. And I know it has in different forms. It's just hard when you sit in this seat.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily see it all. Like I said before, I don't see it the way you see it. Uh-huh. And so I'm in the grind, and some days are just harder than others. But when I'm an entrepreneur through and through. And so, and I'm also passionately committed to loving kids, loving families, loving communities. So I'm going to do my part. And
of course,
that's all I can do, you know?
Well, it's interesting to me because like you saying it out loud means that I'm hearing it out loud. And however many people end up watching or listening to this podcast will have also heard me hear it out loud, which means this whole statement of being consistent, like, you know, as I was endeavoring to put this thing together, this show, the feedback that I kept getting was, wow, that sounds like a good work. I'm glad you're doing that. How can I be a part? Like, that's the feedback that I've gotten. But the reality is doing something like this isn't without its cost in time and resources or whatever. And, you know, it's a big risk to just try something. Mm-hmm. But then to try something that you actually believe to be important and something that the world needs. I mean, right now we live in a time where people are so captivated by magnifying our differences. And I think it's happened at different times throughout history, but like right now, I think we're in one of those seasons, right, where we kind of dehumanize each other in some ways. And so part of the work that I wanted to do with this show was honestly to give us a moment to pause and consider our sameness and to think like freedom is a concept that is contextual. If you are on an island and you can do whatever you want, are you really free, or are you trapped by the island because you are not in the context of any other humans, right? Like that's I don't know, it's like an existential question or something, but again, you said it out loud, so now I'm like, okay, well, I guess giddy up, because this is not something that I'm doing because I want to. I mean, of course, yeah, it helps to grow a brand, but like that's not. If that was all it was, it wouldn't be enough to get me to commit to doing this, right? And so, yeah. Thanks for being my big sister again and sharing that. So, well, real quick, I want to, because I mean, time has just flown by. You've got the Music City Kids.
Yeah.
But the reality is you have spent decades creating and fine-tuning and updating for the times an incredible curriculum that any educator could just plug and play, assuming they have the right heart to do it. Like I'm kind of a believer that if you want to share the stuff, you got to be the stuff, right? Like, so I'm not necessarily saying every educator, but I would say any person who has a heart to like see kids go. This is the phrase that always echoes in my brain when I think of the work that you do is risk to resiliency, right? That's probably you're doing. You probably told me that in one of our trainings way back in the day. but um, but when you're doing any educator who endeavors to really be a part of that transformation for kids, whether it's in their perspectives about themselves, whether it's about their perspectives about each other, their future prospects, what's even possible in life, going from risk to resiliency and then even to thriving, right? Like being a source of life for other people, a source of love and blessing to other people. You've created materials to absolutely help on the journey, and it's research. Like I think it's very, very research. So talk a little bit about that and how people can connect with you and any of that stuff. I think it would be a big whiff to not at least share that.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So the curriculum is research-based. It's year-long curriculum. So there's 24 lessons based on 24 character traits like courage, honesty, kindness, responsibility, self-control, dependability. And it's really taking these concepts that we as adults may think we understand and we expect kids to understand and breaking them down into kid-friendly language. Mm-hmm. And then applying multimodal opportunities for kids to learn to make it real. Like, this is what courage looks like to me, and this is how I can apply it in my world. So the lessons have a literature basis, so the best of children's literature, and guided conversation questions, journaling opportunities, and then all sorts of other things like games and art and research and service learning, give back things. And it just makes it fun. And the whole idea is to create a common language and provide shared experiences in order to create a safe and nurturing environment for kids. And that can be either at school or camp or after school or even home. And so part of the pivot that I mentioned earlier was really looking at the fact that kids are not back in school right now because we are still in the midst of a global pandemic, and education is going through this massive shift, which in many ways I'm excited about. And so how can we provide love in a big world to families? Mm-hmm. How can we support moms and dads, grandparents, aunts, uncles, community members who are
at large?
Yeah. So how can we provide what we do to the home, or to that smaller nucleus of families coming together in pods? There's a lot of talk about the pods right now, so that it's relevant to them, because this is just the stuff of life. I mean, I think I'd be remiss to not mention, like you said, we're living in an environment where we're dehumanizing one another, whether it's because of color of skin or political affiliation. And one of the things that I am adamant about with Love in a Big World is that when we talk to kids about respect and honesty and cooperation and forgiveness, I mean, these are the things that make us human. And regardless of our differences, we can all agree that these are things that we need for ourselves and for our world. Mm-hmm. And that's why I feel incredibly on purpose at this moment in time. Yeah. So in order to find out about it, it's loveinaBigWorld.org, or email me, Tamara at loveinaBigWorld.org.
Well, I will certainly link all of your information. If you were, this is a question that I feel like is very useful for me. And so I don't know if it's useful for anyone else, but I'm going to ask it because it's my show. If you were to go back in time, none of us can do this in real life, but if you could go back in time 30 years, mm-hmm. And talk to your younger self, is there anything that you would want to just like grab your younger self's face and just say, I hope that you understand this, because you will live a more full experience?
That's a good question. And I would probably say what I said earlier, which is, hey, Tamara, you are loved, not because of what you do, but just because of who you are.
Yeah.
Because it took me a really long time to understand that, because I was really good at working to please myself and please other people, and didn't have a clue about the fact that I was just loved because I am.
Yeah.
Period. So that's one of the things that I try to let my own children know, is that, and I remember my mom and dad singing me this silly little song from the time I was little. I love you when you're good, and I love you when you're bad. I love you when you're happy, and I love you when you're sad. I love you, love you, love you, love you, love you all the time. And even though they said that to me, I didn't really, like, there were so many things that just blocked it from getting into my heart.
Yeah.
But I've tried to communicate that to my kids too. And to every child, every adult that I come in contact with, to let them know that, and that doesn't mean that there's not standards of appropriate behavior. I'm not giving license, but at the same time, a lot of times the things that get us into trouble or cause us to hurt ourselves or hurt other people come out of our own brokenness. And so to just let people know, hey, you're safe with me, and to try to create that safe place for people to share their hearts, I think is one of the greatest gifts that we can give to the world. So if I could have given that to myself at a younger age, I can only imagine the difference it would have made for me.
Well, I want you to know that you are giving that gift to countless people now. Like the work that you do, I mean, I feel like the work that you do is maybe ahead of your own development. And I think that's just kind of the way it is sometimes. Like, I truly believe, I mean, that I write. And, there were lots of times when I would write something, and then 2 years later I would read it and I would be like, who wrote this?
Right?
This is good. Like, and I would be sitting there under the recognition that I'm not smart enough to have written this. Yet I'm sitting there being taught by whatever it is that I wrote. And this is not like a pat me on the shoulder. I'm just saying that there's some supernatural thing that happens when you do the thing that you're called to do that extends into the future.
Yes.
Right? A version of yourself that you have not yet even become. And I feel like hearing your story, it makes me feel a little less crazy, because like there's many moments where I'm like, I've not yet embodied this person that I'm busy trying to become. Yet I'm throwing off into the future these things, like the work that you do with kids. Just hearing your story, I feel like has been that for you kind of consistently. It's thrown your future, the better version of your you're awesome, but like the more peaceful version of yourself, or the more content version of yourself, whatever fill in the blank. I feel like there's something that happens when you're in your calling, when you're doing exactly what you believe you're created to do. Yes. That kind of is a searchlight. It shows you the way that you're supposed to go. And I find that amazing. Like and I don't know that I fully understand it, and I don't know that I have to.
I think I concur with all that you said, and I think it's really about divine purpose. And I don't know if you saw any of the posts that have been up in the past week about Chadwick Boseman and what he said at Howard University, and how he just focused on, like, you have a purpose. And I think when we are living to our purpose, we have those supernatural moments that you're talking about, where we know that we're leaving an indelible mark on the world. And even if we don't see it at the moment, there's something of greater value than what we can even comprehend.
Yeah.
And that's the legacy that we all hope to leave.
Well, I wish we could spend the rest of the day, I truly do, talking. But This has been so good, and we will always come back together. But for all of you who are listening, I hope you get in touch with Tamara. I mean, if you got children or you are in some way in anybody's life, any child's life, you would be helped. I mean, I know as a parent, there's all sorts of moments when you feel like, I don't know what to do. At least I have them, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. When you talk about support in ways that are actually tangible and measurable in terms of the activity and the conversations that you can have, I don't really know, not to get into comparisons, but I don't really know that there's much out there that is going to be as useful and as thorough in terms of character development as what Tamara and has created over the years through Love in a Big World. So I hope that you get in touch with her if you fall into that category. And of course, I will, as always, I want to connect with you. There's a few ways to do that. You can obviously leave a comment below so I can get to know you better and how to better serve you. And of course, you can follow my handles on Instagram and on Facebook. It's at Chuoparah, CHUOPARAH. And of course, as always, I hope that you have a great rest of your week whenever you're listening to this, and build a vision, build a life. See you later, guys.